Hi everyone, it's Nicole Spohr and welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be creating an inside spinner fairy card using the Simon Says Stamp Fairytale Spinners 6x8 stamp set. Not only are we going to be creating this darling scene inside the card that is interactive, but we're going to be embellishing the front of the card as well. So we're going to be using lots and lots of images from this great stamp set to create a really fun thank you themed card. For the inside panel, we're going to trim off 1/4 inch, making our cardstock 5 1/4 by 8 1/2 inches. Then we're going to score it at 4 1/4 inches, and then from each side at 2 1/4 inches, creating this kind of M-shaped insert that's going to fit inside of our card. The other cardstock I have there is a standard size A2 card that measures 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches when closed. I'm going to reinforce the seams, the score lines there that I created with my score pal using a bone folder. Attaching this inside panel to the card is going to be pretty much the last thing we do. I am going to take this outside in stitched circle die from Fawn, and we're going to die cut this from the center of our card. Any shape is really going to work here. I particularly like circle type shapes. What I was looking for when picking a die was something that would work with the stamp that I'm using. So there's a front and a back for both of the fairies in the Fairytale Spinners stamp set, and I needed to make sure it was big enough so that when my fairy is placed in this, it's going to be able to spin and move around. I used the largest size die from this die collection. Next, we're going to create the pieces for the front of the card. I trimmed a piece of the blue cardstock here, the darker of the two blue cardstocks, to 3 by 5 1/4 inches, and then I'm going to trim a white cardstock panel to 3 1/2 by 5 1/2 inches. Only a 1/2 inch bigger, and then from both sides we're going to use this really great Scallop Stitches die from Simon Says Stamp. It actually comes in a trio of shapes. This is the medium size scallop from that, and we're going to create a great scallop design down both sides. I opted to make the front panel for my card, instead of having it fill the whole thing, it's just going to be this center panel down the center. And I am going to be stenciling and stamping on the blue cardstock piece, but I wanted to frame it up with this nice little white scallop. So on this center piece, we are going to take the Simon Says Stamp Clouds for Days stencil, and we're going to just kind of pounce on some YETI white ink. This is a white pigment ink from Fawn, to completely cover and create those clouds. Now, because this is a pigment ink, it is going to stay wet for a while. I am going to want to stamp and emboss over the top of this, and how I'm going to get around that, you can hit it with a heat tool if you want to. What I actually did was I set it aside, I stamped the images that I thought I wanted to use for the card. I'm stamping these on some Bristol smooth cardstock so that I can use my Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers for no line coloring. Just the act of letting that ink sit and dry while we're going to stamp and color, that ink would probably dry. I did this a little later in the day, and so what I did was let it sit and dry overnight. And when I came back, I didn't have to worry about stamping on top of it and having my embossing powder stick to any of those embossed areas. I will tell you though, when I came to the center part of the card, I did all of that in one day, but I simply stamped it and let it sit for probably an hour and a half. I went and had lunch, I colored some additional images, did a few other little things on the computer, and came back to it, and it was also dry. So it does dry fairly quick. You would not have to let it set overnight, but I definitely recommend. I like air drying better because I don't have to worry about the cardstock curling up. I am coloring in my images with Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. These were so much fun to color, you guys. I really enjoyed the coloring process here today. You will notice I did not use the grass image for my card. I probably would have. I didn't realize until I kind of got a little further into coloring my images, there's not a coordinating die for the grass. And so because of that, and I did not want to cut out around all those little blades of grass, I'm going to use a grass die instead, and we'll just not color that for this card. I did start with the back side of my spinner fairy. I don't really know why, but I wanted to color in those beautiful fairy wings. I did blue and light blue for this fairy, and then we're using green and yellow green for her cute little dress. She really kind of reminded me of Tinkerbell a little bit, I guess, with the little petals for her skirt. And just remember, everything we're coloring here is going to be pretty much replicated for the front-facing fairy, and we'll get to her in a little bit. Then I started coloring in the flowers, and I really particularly love that they're scaled fairly large, which works really nice with these little fairies. So it looks like they're, you know, fluttering around a beautiful flower garden. Peach pink, sugared almond pink, green, and yellow green were used for this flower and the stem and leaf. Then we're going to color in the rest of the back side of the fairy. I did move, I generally try to stick with one image at a time, but I wanted to be super careful that I didn't drag my hand through the ink. And just to be completely honest and completely transparent, I did do that when I colored in the front-facing fairy. I was so mad at myself. I got clear to almost the end, and I drug my hand through the green ink. It smeared all over her arm. I tried to lift it off with my blender. I tried to lift it off with water. It smeared, it got messy, and pretty much at that point, I shut off the light to my office and went to bed and came back the next morning and recolored her. Sometimes you just have to walk away. I know better. So I'm going to leave in the coloring here today for this. Just know that this image had that little accident happen. If you want to be super careful, just put a clean scrap piece of paper underneath your hand. I color, I also write with my hand laying on the table. It is something that, you know, I think it's probably, maybe, I want to say it's fairly common, maybe it's because I do it. I know that as far as writing goes, it was just something I did when I was little and they never corrected it. And so it's a really, really hard habit to break. I usually just keep a piece of scrap paper or a large Post-it note, and I will, you know, lay that down underneath my hand and be really, really careful with that and make sure I'm moving it so that I am not accidentally smearing this ink. These are water-based markers, so they're not going to dry as fast as like an alcohol ink-based marker like Copics. And that's why you're going to get some of that smearing and things until the ink is all the way dry. They have the these fairies just have the cutest little faces. I absolutely love this stamp set. And I love that it's made for interactive spinner cards, which is just a really fun card to create and fairly simple after you've done a few of them. But I just think it's lots and lots of fun, and it would make anyone smile. For the hair, I was very conscious of wanting to get that hair texture. You'll notice that in the back version that I did earlier, I'm kind of just going in with my mid-brown, darker brown color and feathering that in, and then I'm feathering the beige color over that. I'm not necessarily blending it all the way out. I do think when I colored the front-facing version, I blended a lot more than I really would have liked to. When that happens, you can always go back with your dark marker and go back over it. And this is where the smearing incident happened, is when I went over that. You can see the green of her dress smeared into her arm. So I'm just going to color in this flower in her hair with peach pink and sugared almond pink. And I finished coloring her wings with blue and light blue. For the fairy that's going to go on the front of the card, I love her. I did a little bit different combination for her dress and wings. So we've got dark blue wings for the fairy on the inside of the card. This little fairy is going to feature super light blue, kind of iridescent-y wings. I didn't add sparkle to them, but I could, I guess, if I wanted to. But very, very light blue with the light blue marker and the blender. So I wanted it to be very light out at the tips. So I only used one colored marker and then the blender to blend that out. Her dress is going to be light violet and pale violet, which ended up being super pretty as well. And then I wanted to give her blonde hair. I opted to use mustard and pale yellow. Not a combination I necessarily would have thought of to start with. I do like mustard for hair. I don't know that I've ever used pale yellow though before. And you'll notice that it really just gives that nice little highlight. It blends really nicely with the mustard. I was super happy with how that turned out. I'm just gonna add in a little more texture to her hair because I felt like it blended too much. I'm gonna draw in the eyes with a fine tip black pen. I did this for both fairies, and then I did add some little eyelashes. I drew in the mouth. Faces are always so super important. We're going to trace out the petals of her dress then with our light violet marker and blend out with pale violet. Again, definitely going for a little bit softer colors. And probably my favorite thing about her dress is I'm going to go in with a Sakura Stardust glitter pen, and I'm going to add little dots of sparkle to the bodice of her dress and also around the flouncy hem. And it's so hard to see on camera, I think, but in real life, when you kind of tip the card at an angle, you get these great little glittery dots all over the dress, which are really fun. And I'll do that here in a second. We're going to add in the color for her little fairy wings. Just add in a little of the light blue color and then blend out with the blender pen. I stamped everything with Lawn Fawn Jellyfish ink. That is the Lawn Fawn's No Line ink pad. It works fantastic. I love it. And I did go back in and add a little bit more of light blue because I felt like it faded just a tiny too much in a few spots. Color in her little fairy shoes. And then for the little detail accent hair comb in her hair, I'm using bright yellow and yellow for a fun little pop of color. And here's that Stardust pin. And I'm just adding all those little dots around the flouncy hem and then on the bodice of her dress. There you can see it a little bit better. For my large flower, we're going to be using bright yellow, yellow, and pale yellow. Again, kind of doing that same feathering technique I did for the hair, where we're pulling the darkest color out from the center of each flower petal, then pulling out our mid-tone color, and finally finishing with the light pale yellow color at the very tips of our petals. Green and yellow green for the stems. I kind of mixed up the stems. So some stems are going to be green and yellow green. Some are going to be green, light green and yellow green, or light green and yellow green. Any of those color combinations, just to give a little variety to the stems on our flowers. And I am pretty sure I stamped everything but the back side of this fairy for the front of the card, and then the grass. And there's a few teeny tiny images that I didn't use, but any of the outline flower images, and then of course the fairies that we're using, and both butterflies, I stamped. So I used pretty much everything from this stamp set. And something I think that is important to note is everything for the front and inside of my card, all the stamps, including our sentiments, are from this single stamp set. The rose we're coloring with carmine red, light carmine, green, light green, and yellow green. I am also die cutting as I go. I know if you've followed me for a while, you know that I am a pretty big proponent of die cutting kind of all at once if possible, just to kind of eliminate all of those extra steps, all that time spent die cutting, except for when I'm coloring with Zig Clean Color Real Brush markers. There are times where I will just die cut 1 or 2 images at a time, just simply to get them die cut and out of the way. And that way I don't have to worry about dragging my hand through the ink. The little butterfly here is going to be purple and dark pink, which I loved how this color combination turned out. And I colored in the antenna and body of the butterfly with the black multi-liner pen, same pen I used for the faces on the fairies. We just have a few little images left, and then we can stamp the rest of the front of the card before we move on to the inside spinner portion. So we have the front-facing butterfly we're going to color with blue and light blue. These are the 2 colors I used for the wings on the fairy that will be the spinner. You can see her there up at the top of the screen. And then I've got my additional flowers and butterflies that we are going to stamp and color for the inside. For the grassy edges, we're using the Grassy Edges die from Simon Says Stamp. I've die cut that from Fawn Cilantro cardstock 2 times. That way we have somewhere great to tuck in all of our flowers. And I'm ready to start stamping. I want to do like the little fairy glittery image from the Fairytale spinners and a sentiment. We're going to stamp those with a embossing ink. I'm using the Fawn embossing ink here today. And we're going to stamp and emboss with silver embossing powder. I use white a lot, but today I decided to use silver, and I love how it looks with our white inking in the background. The Clouds for Days stencil is so fun. I did want to mention with that, I often, when I use the Clouds for Days stencil, I use that outer edge of it because you can create the cloudy borders, but it also has the cloud shapes on the center of the stencil, which I think is super smart because it gives you a couple different options. And in this case, I thought these clouds, the clouds from the center of the stencil, work really well. We'll talk a little bit more about that, or you'll see it again when I stencil the inside panels of the card. And because this panel was allowed to air dry, you can see that my embossing powder is not sticking to the clouds. I'm easily able to just tap off that excess powder and heat set my sentiments. We'll add just a couple more of those little sparkly things up at the top. And I want to add some ink to my grassy borders. We're going to use the Simon Says Stamp Teal ink and a blending brush to add a little bit of a darker edge just to the top of the grassy edges. Not all over, but it gives some nice depth and dimension. And this ink will it's still going to definitely have a prominent edge to the grass, but it will smooth out as the ink dries into the cardstock. We'll adhere the shorter border to the larger one, and then adhere those to our little center panel. If you want them to line up perfectly, you can place them in your MISTI and line them up there in one of the corners. It works fantastic and there's no guesswork involved. It's starting to look like a scene. We're going to place this panel then on our white panel that we die cut with the scalloped edge. And then I'm going to tuck my flowers in and just kind of play around with placement before I secure anything. And this is important because some of the flowers are going to overlap, and I also want to make sure that the fairy is right where I want her to go. I'm going to lay those down, and when I'm happy with the placement, we're going to start securing the flowers. And I love tucking in the ends of those flowers between those two borders. I think it looks really nice. The butterflies and the fairy are all going to be adhered to the card with foam adhesive. That'll give a little depth and dimension to a few of those images. Isn't that so cute? I just think these images are so much fun. And then of course our second little butterfly we're going to pop in place. And there's what it's going to look like when we adhere it to our card. Now I'm not going to adhere it yet, and that's because I do want to do a little work back behind that circular opening. I'm going to take my Clouds for Days stencil and my white pigment ink, and we're going to pounce that ink on again so that through the circle opening, when you see the fairy spinning, there's going to be kind of a similar scene back behind our fairy. But I don't want it to take tons of time, and I also don't want any layers. So a stencil is fantastic for that. It's one of the other reasons that I used a blue cardstock note card, is that way the background scene is blue with some nice little white clouds. We'll add a little stamping and embossing, but other than that, very simple. Also on the spinner panel itself, I'm going to stencil a few additional clouds. So it's a nice seamless design. Now these two pieces I also let set and air dry, but you could speed that up with a heat tool if you want to. Because I loved that Stardust glitter pen on the fairy for the front of the card, we're going to do that for the spinner fairy. On her wings, we're just going to add some nice little glittery dots all over so that when she's spinning around there, you're going to get a nice little touch of sparkle. It's nice and subtle, but every fairy's got to have a little bit of pixie dust. And there is our front and back. Aren't those so cute? I have all of my extra flowers. I've got my panels. Now, if you want to do any stamping, now is the time before we secure anything to the card, and I do. I'm going to stamp fairy kisses and best wishes inside. I should probably mention on the front of the card, I did thanks so very much. So we're going to stamp a little additional sentiment, and then we're going to stamp those little sparklies throughout. And it ties everything together really nicely without actually adding extra layers or anything like that. Very, very simple. Once we have all of our stamping and embossing done, and I did add, there's going to be some in the background. Like I mentioned, they're going to be back behind our spinning fairy, and then some on the actual inside panel as well. So we'll just add a few of those. Now, something to make note of, the score lines on this inside panel. Because the flowers have that nice natural curve to them, I really had to play around with placement of the flowers because I don't want any of them to overlap the score lines because my card won't fold nicely. And because of that, I really kind of played around, and I kept trying to put the pink flower slightly overlapping the circle, and it just did not work. And luckily, I was able to kind of position and move those around until I got something that looked nice and cute. But that's something to keep in mind that can be a little bit tricky as far as placement if you want to add extra images. You could also completely not do that. I just wanted to carry over the front of the card to the inside of the card, and so I really had to play around with the flowers. Now these two ends where the adhesive goes, I want that to be nice and strong. So I used some Lawn Fawn double-sided adhesive. And then I'm also going to secure some embroidery, or pardon me, some sewing thread is actually what I used. I have clear thread somewhere, but I haven't seen it since I moved a year ago. And when I went to look for it, I couldn't find it anywhere. I must need to get some more. I'm sure it just is in a box I haven't opened. But anyway, I just used some white because that worked really well. It doesn't show up that much. I did secure it with packing tape. I'm going to tell you right now, that did not last. I actually ended up using some double-sided adhesive, some really strong double-sided adhesive. I kind of had to pull everything apart. I would definitely recommend using that. After I used the strong adhesive, I put a little dab of liquid glue on that and let it set and completely dry because I did not want my string moving. My string actually lost some slack, and so my spinner wasn't working very well. Your spinner isn't going to work unless that string is nice and taut. Can't talk. So definitely make sure that it's really important that you get the string adhered nice and tight. That way, whatever you place on the spinner is going to work great. To adhere this piece, let's adhere the spinner first. So I just put a little tape runner on one side of the spinner while I get that lined up. And we want to make sure that nothing is impeding her, that she's going to be able to spin around. And then on the other half, the other side of the spinner, I cover that with liquid glue and completely pinch those together. I even put something heavy on top. I put 2 Misties on top of it to hold it down flat while that is drying. And we want to make sure they line up. Look how cute that is. Lines up perfectly. I love it. And as soon as the glue is dry, we are ready to put it all together. We peeled off the tape and then went ahead and placed that on either side. I'm going to adhere the front panel to the front of the card. And then our glue is dry inside, so now we'll just simply remove the backing paper from one side, and I'll show you how I line that up with the inside of the card, fold it down flat, and then shut the card to attach the other side. If you ever have trouble getting the backing paper to come up off, I like to use a tip of the Spellbinders Tool-in-One, and then I'm simply lining up the side that I removed the backing paper, pressing that down. We're going to fold down the other side, peel off the backing paper, and fold our card to sandwich that. And then we can wind up our fairy and watch her spin. Isn't that so cute? To save a little time, I did go ahead and adhere my flowers mostly off screen, or all off screen, I suppose I should say, but I did make sure and not have any of them overlap any of those score lines on the center part of our card. And here is a look at the finished card design. You simply wind up the fairy, shut the card, place it in an envelope, and when you pull it out and the recipient opens it, the fairy should spin. And then she's just going to kind of hang out and spin around there anyway, which is so much fun. It's a really great look, and when the recipient puts it up on, you know, maybe a mantle or the tabletop or something, it's just really, really cute. Thank you guys so much for joining me today for this Inside Spinner Fairy card featuring Simon Says Stamp, Stamps and Dies. The supplies I used to create this fairy card are listed and linked below the video here on YouTube. Here are a couple more videos featuring Simon Says Stamp, Stamps and Dies, and other products that you might be interested in. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell to never miss a new card making video. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll catch you next time.